Jordan's first made shot was almost perfect to be the first score for Michael Jordan in the NBA because it was spectacular. It was a spinning, hanging, in traffic, off the glass.
Love it, mate. And I actually, in my notes as well, had a description of his first score as well. It was about 7 minutes 30 left in the first quarter when he made the score. The Bulls were 12-8 ahead at the time. And I've got here that he had a hesitation dribble, spin move, and hits off glass. And I had an exclamation mark. Who knows why, because nobody except myself is looking at this piece of paper.
If I actually make note on the podcast of all the exclamation marks that I've used in mine, it'd probably take an extra 8 or 10 minutes onto the podcast, mate.
I always like to say that Michael got to play with me for a year at North Carolina. I think it really helped him.
Spectacular player from the beginning.
You can see right away Jordan was going to be a big-time scorer.
And showed what an impact he was going to have on the league.
This is NB 85, celebrating the 30-year anniversary of Michael Jordan's rookie season in the NBA. And now, your hosts, Adam Ryan and Aaron Steen.
Welcome back to the show, Aaron, and thanks for joining me for episode 6 of NB 85. How are you, mate?
Good, mate. I'm a big Derrick Rose fan, and I went to the effort of finding a copy of Derrick Rose's first game as a Bull from 2008 when they played at home against the Milwaukee Bucks, and I treasure that game. To be able to break down the first ever game in a Chicago Bulls uniform for Michael Jordan from 30 years ago, mate, yeah, it's about to happen.
Giving it the perfect lead in there, mate. So we're going to be chatting exclusively today about MJ's first regular season NBA game, so it's going to be some great stuff. This episode will be an absolute ripper. Some quick follow-up, mate, just before we get into the episode itself. Want to give a big thank you to a friend of ours, Marv, who is involved with the Soul Collector website. Do you want to maybe just elaborate a little bit further for us, mate?
Marv's Twitter handle is at MJO23DAN, and the man is I'll use his term, an aficionado on everything to do with Air Jordan sneaker line. We spoke a little bit with Marv online about the Nike Airship line and the whole situation with the other band, Air Jordan 1s, in the other lead up to him posting an article on soulcollector.com, to which he so graciously gave yourself, Adam, me, and a good friend, Adam Howes, a shout out in the article, which was a very cool way to start my day over here in Australia.
It was a great way to start, and thank you again, Marv, for that. Very generous. And the information that he's referring to about the band Air Jordans, we covered in a lot of depth in episode 5 of this series, so the episode previous to this.
Michael Jordan's NBA regular season debut, October 26, 1984.
We've been recently able to acquire a copy of Jordan's first game on DVD. Pretty exciting stuff when we both had access to be able to watch this in the lead up to the episode that we're recording today, and there's plenty of great discussion points that we're about to delve into, including a listener question as well, which I'm excited to get to as well as we get into the chat too, mate.
Especially considering how hard to come by this game was in its entirety up until the last couple of months. You're more of an aficionado when it comes to the other trading circles for NBA games, and I'm sure that you can go into a bit more detail as to how hard this game has been to come by.
Oh, for sure, mate. This would be probably one of the top 5 in the holy grail of Jordan games that weren't previously available in full. As you alluded to, there was only a joined-in-progress version from Hardwood Classics through NBA TV, I believe, and that was joined in progress in the third quarter, so not much of the game at all was able to be seen, but this one's the entire game. We've had a chance to watch it. We've made copious amounts of notes, and I'm sure that everyone listening is going to get a bit of a thrill out of reliving this first game of Jordan, because not a whole lot of people at all have actually seen this yet. The game itself hasn't really even reached the wider trading community at this stage. Exciting stuff, mate. The game itself was played on October the 26th in 1984. The Washington Bullets took on the Chicago Bulls at the old Chicago Stadium. Just for a bit of perspective, the previous season, the Washington Bullets went 35-47. The Chicago Bulls were 27-55. So obviously the expectations, given they drafted Jordan, gold medalist with the US team in the 84 Olympics. He had a great preseason, which we discussed in depth for episode 5 of this series. The coaches for each team, Chicago was led by Kevin Lockery and Washington was led by Gene Shue. Now, the TV coverage that we've got, it wasn't the Bulls TV. It was the Washington Bullets coverage, and the play-by-play man was Jim Brinson, and he was joined by Hall of Famer Wes Unseld.
Yeah, I actually have written in my notes Jim Brinton and Wes Unseld, unfortunately, on the call. It would have been an amazing thing to have Red Kerr and Milo Hamilton on the call, but I guess beggars can't be choosers, because just the opportunity to be able to see this game could have just about had anyone commentating, and it would have been awesome to watch.
There's a brief pre-game show that we get to see on this game DVD as well, and you've got a few thoughts on that as well, mate?
Yeah. Never would I imagine that a pre-game interview from Michael Jordan's first game in 1984 would bore me. There's nothing worse than an interviewer that isn't listening to the interviewee's answers, and Unseld cut Gene Shaw off at least twice as he was answering Unseld's questions. The late Washington Bullets owner Abe Pollan had a reputation as hiring Bullets people for jobs with his franchise, and it appears that this was the case with Wes, who wasn't great as an announcer, which I'll elaborate on with a couple of his comments during this game later on.
Yep.
In my opinion, ex-players don't always make very good announcers, as guys like Magic Johnson, Walt Frazier, and Austin Carr, who is the current colour man for the Cavs, who is just awful to listen to, have all shown me that the ability to play doesn't always transfer to an ability behind the mic. Instead of getting the right person for the job, Abe Pollan was known to hire Bullets ex-players and staff for job roles. And Wes Unseld actually ultimately got the job as Bullets GM later on down the track, which is a hiring that draws a bit of criticism even today in 2014.
It does, mate. So I'm just wondering if you're not totally sold on Wes as a commentator, would you be unsold?
As soon as you mention the word sold, thanks, mate.
Yeah, no worries. This game DVD as well had another interesting thing about it. We got the actual feed from the Washington TV coverage. It wasn't actually a game complete with commercials, so there's quite a bit of dead footage, and I know that you've got something that you wanted to mention about that as well, mate.
Yeah, there's a few bits and pieces throughout the game, during a timeout, during halftime, whatnot, where there's this dead footage and you can hear the other commentators talking amongst themselves and talking to their producers, which a couple of the things that they said were quite humorous, and I'll bring them up later on.
Yep, there's some funny stuff, and because of that, it led to a few amusing anecdotes that we'll mention throughout the episode as well. Just one more thing before we get into the game itself. You want to say a couple of quick comments about some pre-season newspaper articles?
Yeah, there was a lot of talk during the preseason in newspaper articles that we've both read during the research for this series, that the Bulls were still to sign big man David Greenwood, who, in my opinion, is best known as the guy that the Bulls got at pick number 2 when they lost the coin toss that eventually netted the Lakers Irvin Johnson in 1979. And I mentioned before that Wes Unseld wasn't great with some of his comments during the game, and the first one that raised my eyebrows was that he believed that the Bulls' success in the 85 season may hinge on the unsigned big man David Greenwood.
Fair point that you make about David Greenwood being most known for his link to the Magic Johnson selection. Perhaps Wes was overstating things just a little bit.
But there was quite a bit of coverage about the Bulls and the fact that they hadn't signed Greenwood up until when the other season started. So I guess we're undermining his profile at the time, perhaps.
I guess 30 years down the track, a lot of people would mostly remember him based on your aforementioned comment about the draft and Magic Johnson. But of course, at the time, he certainly was a player that many expected would go on to bigger and better things.
Both teams had their whole lineups introduced before the game, which was, well, it was cool and very different. It was very all-star game-ish when during the all-star game, all 12 players who play on the East and West squad all get introduced. So that was something different. The other music playing during the Bulls introductions was Thriller by Michael Jackson. The Bulls lineup on opening day was Sidney Green, Rod Higgins, Charles Jones, Dave Corzine, who was introduced to a mix of booze and cheers, which we'll elaborate on a little bit later on. Jawan Oldham, Quinton Daly, who got a great response from the crowd when he was introduced. Wes Matthews, Orlando Woolridge, Steve Johnson, the newly acquired Caldwell Jones, also got a great ovation from the crowd. Ennis Swatley and in the introduction for his first ever NBA game as a Chicago Bull, MJ was announced to a great ovation from the Chicago Bulls crowd. And I don't know if it may have been MJ's youthful enthusiasm or the excitement for his first introduction for his first game. But instead of running out in between the cheerleader guard that all of the other players were introduced to and run out into the middle of the court, he cut through the other side of the guard instead of running down the middle of them, which I found quite funny.
I think you might have got a couple of phone numbers on the way through too, mate. Now, you mentioned some good names there on the Bulls roster, mate. There's a couple of notables I'd like to make mention of from the Bullets side of things, and one of them's Charles Davis, who would be a future Chicago Bull in the 89 and 90 seasons. We also had Gus Williams, who was the NBA champion on the Seattle Supersonics in 1979. He was a two-time All-Star and fortuitously was nicknamed the Wizard, maybe just coincidental as well, given that the Bullets would eventually change their name to the Wizards many years hence. We've got Darren Day, who had one game with the Chicago Bulls during the 87 season. Former podcast guest, Jeff Ruland, episode number 45, inallairness.com/45.
Hashtag shameless self-promotion.
That's true. His partner in crime, who formed the other half of the Beef Brothers, Mr. Rick Mahorn, was also on that Washington squad. And Frank Johnson. Most people would probably straight away think to him as a member of the 1993 Phoenix Suns when he joined that team as a free agent for that season, mate. And you've mentioned his name in a previous episode of the In All Airness podcast too.
Yeah, it makes sense if a lot of people remember him from that 93 Phoenix Suns team, because that was one of the great teams of the 1990s. And Frankie Johnson gave me some very fond memories of that air ball that he threw up at the end of Game 6, as the other Bulls, again, stole home court advantage from the Suns and won their third consecutive title.
For the Bulls, a few of the notable players, and you mentioned all of them previously, but a couple of quick stats and bits and pieces about them. Rod Higgins was a 13-year NBA veteran, but also is a long-time Jordan friend. They became very close during Jordan's rookie season, and that friendship obviously developed over the following decades and still has to this day. We've got Wes Matthews, who was drafted originally by Washington with the number 14 pick in the 1980 draft. He was actually traded away from the Bullets before the end of his first season, so I'm not sure exactly what happened behind the scenes there, but clearly something didn't work in terms of that relationship. He was later a two-time NBA champion with the LA Lakers in 87 and 88. We've got Dave Corzine, who, as you mentioned, and we'll mention throughout this episode as well, the crowd were on him throughout the game for the most part, but researching a bit more about his career before today's chat, he's Illinois born. He played his high school and college basketball in Illinois. He spent 7 seasons with the Bulls, and he only missed 18 regular season games over those 7 seasons, and yet, for whatever reason, the crowd were almost perennially on Corzine's back the entire time that he played for the franchise, so he couldn't really put a foot right, unfortunately, and I'm not exactly sure the origins behind that either.
Some really deep Illinois roots for Dave Corzine, which is actually quite surprising considering just how badly the Bulls fans got on his back. So every team has their whipping boy, and Dave Corzine was the 85 Bulls whipping boy for the fans.
Yeah, quite surprising, to be honest. One other guy I'd like to mention is Ennis Watley, who played in the NBA for 10 seasons over a span of 14 years. Most interestingly, perhaps, would be the Bulls actually traded Watley after the 85 season. He was one of the pieces sent to Cleveland in return for would-be fan favourite Charles Oakley, and of course one of MJ's greatest friends to this very day, mate.
My first exposure to Ennis Watley was during the 1992 NBA Finals when he was actually playing with the Portland Trail Blazers. And NBC put up a graphic on the screen. It was entitled "Hindsight is 2020." That in the 1983 draft, the Bulls picked Ennis Watley a couple of spots ahead of Clyde Drexler. And then in the very next draft, 1984, of course, Portland selected Sam Bowie ahead of Michael Jordan. So just showing that everything worked out pretty well for both teams.
As I like to say, mate, NBA history is fascinating. There's plenty of what-ifs that could be played based on selections that were or were not made. The last thing I wanted to quickly mention was that when Jordan was introduced to the crowd, he was the last person to come onto the court. The other Bulls had already given the mantle of team leader to MJ. We are set up for the debut of Michael Jeffrey Jordan. They actually had a ceremonial opening jump ball, and it was Gary Matthews, who research suggests was a left fielder with the Chicago Cubs. and he had the ceremonial tip with Rick Mahorn and Caldwell Jones, and then the game itself got underway.
And I guess it makes sense to have a guy who played for the Cubs do the ceremonial tip for the game because the Cubs were very good back in 1985. On the actual opening tip, MJ was really active right from the start of the game. He caught the opening tip that was won by Caldwell Jones. He missed the game's first shot, and on the Bulls' first defensive possession, and I guess his first defensive possession in the NBA, he knocked away a Washington Bullet pass. So he was very active right from the start.
For sure, and also he actually took all of 15 seconds to jack up that first jump shot as well. So, of course, he wasn't shy from the get-go in terms of looking to get the score.
A sign of things to come. Speaking of guys who love to jack up shots, Orlando Woolridge's amazing athleticism was on show this entire game. Whereas Untold spoke of him playing at the small forward position in a power forward's body because he was an absolute freak of nature, had an amazing rig on him.
Now, I have to make mention of this, mate, because we have a listener question that's coming up shortly from Matthew Heasley. The play in particular I'm referring to here, the commentator Jim Brinson says the following: Jordan just ran into Ricky Mahorn. A fine how do you do that was, because what actually happened was Jordan was playing D near the half court. Nobody obviously motioned to him that Rick Mahorn was just waiting there setting a monster pick as one of the Bullets players dribbled the ball up court, nearly knocked Jordan's head off. Ruland actually hadn't got to the point where his career was starting to get derailed by terrible injury concerns, and Mahorn was a much more prominent player at this time as well, because most people might remember him just more as a role player on those Pistons teams in the late 80s, more so than actually what he really did achieve during the early to mid 80s and beyond.
You call him a role player, and I was fortunate enough to see Mahorn in person in 2012 when I went and saw the Bulls play the Pistons in Detroit, and role is appropriate because, needless to say, he's been in a pretty good paddock. But back in 1984, though, he was young and in really good shape too, played a really good game.
He was, and they would absolute man mountains, those two guys. So no wonder they were known as the Beef Brothers, because a number of different plays throughout the game as well, they just worked in unison on the defensive end and certainly were intimidating.
Jordan's first made shot was almost perfect to be the first score for Michael Jordan in the NBA because it was spectacular. It was a spinning, hanging, in traffic, off the glass.
Love it, mate. And I actually, in my notes as well, had a description of his first score as well. It was about 7 minutes 30 left in the first quarter when he made the score. The Bulls were 12-8 ahead at the time, and I've got here that he had a hesitation dribble, spin move, and hits off glass, and I had an exclamation mark. Who knows why, because nobody except myself is looking at this piece of paper.
If I actually make note on the podcast of all the exclamation marks that I've used in mine, it'd probably take an extra 8 or 10 minutes onto the podcast, mate, because they're right at home when you're talking about this first game for MJ. During a timeout, when we had some of that aforementioned dead air, Jim Brinson said, "Good heavens, I knew there was a reason that I came to Chicago." And I thought that he must have been looking at a replay of Jordan's shot, to which Unseld replied, "It only gets better." It was then that I realised that they weren't talking about Jordan's shot, that they were actually talking about the Lovables who were putting on a show right in front of them.
Oh, that's fantastic. To be honest, I actually had no idea that was the case. I know the audio part of it that you're talking about, and I just assumed they were looking at a replay on their screens in front of them, but I didn't actually look at the screen in enough detail to realise that they were actually referring to the Lovables, so that's fantastic stuff, mate. Good spotting.
And then to send the Chicago faithful into even more of a frenzy, MJ's second made shot was just as spectacular as what the first one was. My notes say a spinning, falling down, fake to the middle, go baseline to his what would become a patented baseline fadeaway for the N1.
Great stuff again, mate. And I've obviously made notes as well about this particular play. I had written down MJ fakes left, back to basket, spins right, then repeats with more of the same, and just for a change, an exclamation mark. Then I've got here, hits the baseline jumper and is fouled, punctuated by a fist pump. Now, this was actually a would-be patented fist pump because in later parts of his career, he certainly pulled out the fist pump from time to time, but he had it going in his NBA debut, so I thought that was interesting, and of course he was full of enthusiasm, as you had alluded to earlier as well. So that was great to see that he was so pumped up and into the game so early on.
He even pulled out the fist pump during introductions when he was running out onto the court.
He did too, well done.
Off to a flyer with it.
Yeah, he loved it.
A little bit later on in the quarter, the former Bull, Charles Davis, was at the free throw line and was getting the business from the team mascot. Now, this guy, I'd seen him on NBA videos, NBA highlight videos from the 80s and 90s, but never really knew much about him. It was the San Diego Chicken who was holding up a swimsuit model poster under the basket to distract him as he shot his free throws, to which Jim Brinson said it was tough to do the broadcast with the posters around. This, to me, it brings up memories of an NBA Action episode from 1992 that had a segment talking about pressure at the foul line. There was a shot of Larry Bird at the line, and underneath the basket, there were about a half dozen guys holding up a full-length 6 feet tall swimsuit model poster to distract him while he shot his free throws.
That's fantastic. And I don't remember the actual NBA Action episode, but I remember the footage of Bird trying to be distracted by those guys. So that's a great memory for me, and I'm sure many of the listeners to this episode. And another note that I've got from this first quarter, not long after that, Caldwell Jones got the defensive rebound and he dribbled the ball from free throw line to free throw line, and then dished off an amazing bounce pass to Steve Johnson for the easy basket. It was quite interesting to see Caldwell Jones, who was in his mid-30s at this stage, dish off an incredible bounce pass right between two Bullets defenders, and he's a 7-footer, so some great skills there from an ageing Caldwell Jones.
I don't know what it is, but every single time that I see a 7-footer dribble the ball up court, not all 7-footers look like this, but Larry Bird once described Kevin McHale dribbling the basketball as a baby deer on ice. But to Caldwell's credit, he threw a beautiful bounce pass for the Steve Johnson finish.
Also in the first quarter, I actually had to rewind the play to be sure this actually occurred, but Jordan was called for travelling, and he'd actually be whistled for it at least 2 more times in the game, from what I can recall. So the refs weren't ready just yet to allow the future greatest of all time to get away with those particular travelling violations.
And there was a lot of travelling violations in this game.
Near the end of the first quarter, as you alluded to earlier, mate, Orlando Woolridge's athletic prowess was on full display. He had a fantastic game throughout and was the high man in the game overall. I think he had 28 points, but we'll get to all the stats towards the end of the episode. But he really was just a freakish performer, and I think you said it best by saying he had a fantastic rig. And just speaking of that San Diego Chicken, and I think you've got a bit of background about the chicken in just a moment, for no apparent reason, the camera crosses to him and he's picking his nose with the assistance of a giant foam finger.
A bit of backstory on the San Diego Chicken, who was once called the Laurence Olivier of sports mascots by the New York Times, which was an interesting tag.
I'd reckon.
San Diego Chicken was created by Ted Gianorris for an animated TV commercial and rose to fame by entering fans. Oh my God.
That is terrible. He wouldn't have rose to fame. He would have rose to infamy with that sort of stuff.
Jail time.
Oh, my goodness.
Here we go. The San Diego Chicken was created by Ted Gianorris for an animated TV commercial and rose to fame by entertaining fans at events and sporting events. He was at one point fired by his unfortunately named employer, KGB Radio, in 1979. But he was so popular at the time that when fans found out that Gianorris wasn't going to be in the suit, fans booed the hell out of the new guy. After an ensuing court case, he was rehired and was subsequently named in the Sporting News' 100 most powerful people in 20th century sport list. Dead serious.
Oh, that is fantastic. And the fact that he's a chicken is makes it all the more amusing that he was in the 100 most powerful people. Okay, 2 late free throws from Jordan gave him 7 points in that first quarter, and after one, the Bulls got off to a flyer. They were ahead 34-19. Before the second quarter actually begun, we were witness to the Chicken delivering a stunning combo of punches and kicks to an effigy of a referee. Something that you just couldn't imagine happening in 2014 as we record this, but 30 years prior, apparently it's fine to just stand at centre court and start belting the living suitcase out of a ref. You could actually even call it a refugee, I guess, if you wanted to go that far. He topped it off by delivering a diving body drop and had a faux excrement finish. So classy stuff from the Chicken.
That's a sentence I bet you never ever thought that you'd ever say in your lifetime. A faux excrement to finish off.
Exactly right.
He delivered a startling flurry of WWF wrestling moves and at one point, I think a bit of dry humping.
Could have done without that beat, but anyhow, and shout out to Matthew Heasley, who'll be listening to this episode. He's a massive fan of both the podcasts, which I can thank him very much for.
Makes sense.
Thanks, Matthew. And also a massive WWF/WWE fan. The most interesting stuff, perhaps, was that the crowd were absolutely loving every second of this performance.
And I'm sure that in 2014, Adam Silver would absolutely love every minute of such a performance too, of a beating the hell out of a referee.
It would not even happen in a YouTube clip, I don't reckon, if they were just trying to have a funny video that they'd hope would go viral. So really staggering that that could have happened those years ago. Now, in terms of the second quarter itself, on the first Bulls possession, MJ led the break and dished to a cutting Orlando Woolridge for a hammer dunk. So again, just showing off his incredible athleticism. That was worth making mention of. And another great play that wasn't long after Orlando Woolridge's jam is Jordan grabbing the rebound. He went behind his back. He had multiple crossover dribbles and then finished with a no-look pass to Dave Corzine, and the Bulls were ahead by their largest margin of the game, 45-26, which led to a Washington timeout.
MJ was off to a pretty good start in this game, to which Wes Unseld replied that if anyone can hold Jordan, it's Dudley Bradley. And a bit of research showed me that Bradley had played in the CBA the year before, in 1984, after averages of 3 points, 2 rebounds, and .08 steals with the Bulls in 1983. He was actually a member of the Bulls, and left me wondering what the hell Wes was on about. But I then discovered, I dug a little bit more, and I discovered that Bradley had broke a NBA rookie record with 2.57 steals per game in his first year, and had also recorded 9 steals in a game twice. So I guess that Wes redeemed himself a little on that one.
Wow, is that legit?
That is legit.
That's a great stat, mate. Good research there. I'm very impressed, and I better take back some of that laughter for Dudley Bradley. So I'd previously only heard his name really in Dazzling Dunks and Basketball Bloopers, the NBA Entertainment VHS of the late 80s or very early 90s, where he hit a unlikely game winner against, I think it was the Philadelphia 76ers. On the ensuing Bulls possession following the timeout by the Bullets, Jordan sneaks up from behind and gets one of his patented blocks. Probably his most famous from behind block came against Patrick Ewing, also in Chicago Stadium in I think it was the 1988 season, but it's a famous block where Jordan swats Ewing out of bounds and the crowd go berserk. But even from his very early NBA career, Jordan was showing his defensive prowess.
Pretty sure it was in the 87 season, because I can recall that it was that season because my point of reference for when certain things occur, the shoes that Jordan was wearing in that play, and he was wearing the Jordan 2s, which actually it may have been at the beginning of the 88 season because he wore them up until the All-Star break in 1988. So either of us could be right.
Maybe somebody will correct one of us in the future, who knows?
But probably not.
Probably not. That's a fair chance, actually. Now, with the score 45-28, what unfolded next could have been devastating to both Michael Jordan himself and the NBA. MJ was called for his second travel of the half. After the whistle, he decided to drive strong to the hoop and he attempted to throw down a monster dunk, and it was his first attempt at a dunk in his pro career. To say that he landed awkwardly is a huge understatement. He was motionless on the floor for almost 30 seconds and the air went out of the building momentarily.
No pun intended.
I actually had literally and figuratively in my mind as well as I was saying that. He was met at the rim by a brick wall named Jeff Ruland. I did ask Jeff about this when he was a guest on episode 45, and he remembered the play exactly, and also had a really funny anecdote about Orlando Woolridge, which followed shortly thereafter. And here's what Jeff actually said about that particular play. After that play where Jordan tried to dunk over the top of you and hit the floor, he was down on the floor for some time. Do you actually recall the atmosphere in the building at that stage? Because he was the highly touted rookie for the Bulls.
Yeah, like I said, it was obvious that I didn't try to hurt him, but I remember Orlando Woolridge came over and I told him that he needed to turn around and get lost, or he would wind up in worse shape than Michael. I wasn't really in the mood. I remember seeing the video, so I know I checked to see how he was doing. He wasn't malicious. I tried to take the charge. He tried to dunk over me, and just he was too far away, and I was too big of an object, so it wasn't going to happen.
This is NB85.
You mentioned earlier on that we had a question from one of the other listeners, from Matthew Heasley, who asked us how McFilthy and McNasty were Ruland and Mahorn during this game. And I think this is a pretty good example of why those two guys got that nickname, although it was really a pointless dunk attempt over Ruland. As you mentioned before, Jordan had already been called for the other travel and the play had stopped, and Ruland put him on his backside. And this is actually the photo of MJ laying motionless on the court at the hands of the trainers that we've tweeted out in the past, and we'll put on the blog to this episode as well.
Jordan was also called for his third travelling violation of that first half. The referees were quite whistle happy in terms of actually calling him for the travel, and not long after this, Kevin Lockery gets teed up with less than 3 minutes to go in the half, and I just made a little note here to say that Lockery had a similar temperament to future Bulls head coach from 87 onwards, Doug Collins. They both had very similar temperaments, and they were both quite fiery as a player as well. Another funny moment from the first half, Dave Corzine took a wide-open 18-foot jump shot, and Jim Brinson, the commentator, says, "Corzine, he could hit that outside jump, and that one won't drop. It was a brick." As soon as he said that as well, the crowd were absolutely all over Corzine. And then, to make matters worse, he was slow getting back on defence, and I think Jeff Ruland ended up with a dunk at the other end as well, so that just added to the crowd's anger at the fact that Corzine bricked. It didn't even touch the brim, so that play wasn't all that well for Dave Corzine.
No excuses from Dave on the jump shot, but he actually didn't play a majority of the second half of this game with a heel problem. You could see him as he was running up and down the court during the game that he was struggling with one of his feet. So to add insult to injury, he was being booed by the home crowd and also missed most of the game with an injury.
Not ideal.
And it was soon after this that Wes Unseld again put his colour commentary into the spotlight with a great play call on a Cliff Robinson regulation two-hand dunk.
I actually can't remember the play, so obviously it meant a whole lot, and I didn't listen to Wes's commentary, obviously. We better also clarify that it's not Uncle Cliffy, Cliff Robinson, also a former podcast guest. It was his older namesake. That ended the second quarter, and the Bulls were up 57-45, but the Bulls still looked in control. However, that would change in the third quarter. Early in the third quarter, Jordan hit one of two free throws, and then shortly thereafter, on another play, grabbed the offensive board and had a putback, so he entered double digits. He was at 10 points for the game at that stage. Orlando Woolridge, as we mentioned, had a great game. He hit two quick layups early in that third quarter. Later, a spin move in the lane gave him 22 points already just in the third quarter. And the Washington Bullets, Cliff Robinson, had a great putback dunk. Do you actually remember that play? He had a nice one-handed dunk on the putback jam.
I do, and Wes Unseld almost passed out from excitement.
Well, if the previous one was a great play, this really deserved to be the play of the decade. I always knew there was another Cliff Robinson name in the NBA, but this was the first time I'd actually seen more than a couple of seconds of footage of him, and he looked like quite a decent player actually for his time too.
He did, and it was during this third quarter that it really stuck out to me that Steve Johnson for the Bulls was really good down low during this game. He was very dominant around the hoop. He was a guy that I didn't know a whole lot about before I saw him on the end of the Western Conference All-Star bench in 1988 wearing a suit because he was injured at the time and couldn't play in the game. So to make an All-Star team, he wasn't a deal out on court, and he was definitely showing it in the third quarter for the Bulls. Speaking of Matthew Heasley's question before about McFilthy and McNasty, there was a play later on in the third where Mahorn really clobbered Steve Johnson, and it was a no call. And the next thing you see on camera, the San Diego Chicken had the air freshener out because he thought that the no call stank.
Oh, fantastic. I saw that footage of him and I thought, what the heck's going on there? But that was great to see. And of course, the crowd were just loving his antics throughout most of the game, to be honest.
Commentators mentioned again a bit later on in the quarter that Dave Corzine's lack of love from the home crowd. So we'll forget the fact that you had the number 3 draft pick in the game in his first NBA game. I think it was as big a story just how much the Bulls fans hated Dave Corzine.
I still can't get over it. Like, they were on him relentlessly. Hopefully, at a later stage, I might even be able to be fortunate enough to chat to Dave Corzine and ask him what he actually thought about his whole career there with the Bulls, because he was oft maligned, and I think it was unjust for a lot of that What I found interesting was, mate, during the telecast, they had a close-up of Milwaukee's then coach, Don Nelson, and his assistant, Mike Schuler. They were sitting courtside, obviously scouting for a Bulls and Bucks home-and-home series, which would take place the following day and then 2 days after that, which they split between them.
Good to see the Bulls tickets were at a premium at the time when an opposing head coach and assistant can get courtside seats. A very interesting and humorous story about Mike Schuler, Adam, which I haven't made you privy to before this, is that at the press conference when he was named Portland's head coach back in 1987, he actually fell off his chair during the press conference. And we will add a link to this in the show notes.
I love it. I've never heard of this or seen it, so I look forward to that.
I reckon I saw like the bit where he falls off the chair on Dunks and Bloopers once.
Oh, right.
If you see it, you'll go, I remember.
Good to mention that because I probably may have seen it then if that's the case, because I used to watch that video until the tape almost wore out, so maybe it will jog my memory when I do watch it back. But yeah, that's cool. We'll add a link to that in the show notes, definitely.
Washington were advertising 2-for-1 tickets to home games during the other game at Chicago Stadium. Now, I know the Bulls tickets, as I mentioned, were at a premium when Don Nelson is sitting courtside during the game, but it showed that the Bullets had a lack of fan support even back in 1984. During the third quarter, the Bulls coughed up their lead by throwing the ball away on bad passes multiple times. They had 10 third-quarter turnovers.
Yeah, that was pretty ordinary on their behalf. Just speaking of the crowd there, mate, the official attendance for the game at Chicago Stadium was 13,913. Now, that's pretty good considering I actually looked at their attendance figures throughout the entire regular season, and there were actually some games later on in the season which were staggeringly low, even in the 5,000s, which I could not believe.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah, after Jordan had already made an impact in that rookie season, yet there were still games where there was 5,000 people at Chicago Stadium. We'll talk more about that in future episodes of this NBA 85 series, I'm sure.
Probably shows the popularity of the NBA at the time as well. You know, it was probably languishing a little bit. It's well publicised that the league had a bit of an image issue with off-court stuff and even some on-court issues as well. So the crowds, even though they had one of the most exciting players in the NBA, even though a lot of the crowds were really struggling, was probably a sign of the bad times for the NBA.
Let's not forget as well that the NBA finals were only 2 or 3 seasons removed from being shown on tape delay. That says a whole lot about the state of the league in the early 80s as well. Some careless Bulls turnovers, as you said, there was 10 in the quarter, allowed Washington to outscore the Bulls during this third quarter.
The Bullets' comeback in the third quarter was led by Gus Williams with steals, shots. He was getting to the line. He was really dominant in that third quarter.
Quentin Daly as well, mate. We should make mention he had a very solid game, and particularly his second half provided the Bulls with numerous scores.
Yeah, an observation that I made from the game was it was really a terrific offensive guard and was quite automatic on his jumper in this game. Wes Unseld made an observation that he was hitting mid-season shots during the game, so he was in really good nick.
Yeah, you've definitely paid attention to what Wes was saying throughout the game.
Couldn't help it, mate. He was embarrassing himself that much that it was entertaining me almost as much as what the game was.
And hello to Wes Unseld.
If you're listening.
Oh, man, you know me too well. 3/4 of the listeners have probably also chimed in with the same comment. Now, after 3 quarters, the Bulls only had a 4-point lead. So that 19-point lead from earlier that I talked about was whittled down to just 4. Now, in the fourth quarter, mate, possibly the best sequence of the game occurs. It was early in the quarter. MJ spins baseline and gets blocked by Rick Mahorn. Frank Johnson is then blocked at the other end by Jawan Oldham. Then Mahorn blocks a second straight shot and it goes into the hands of Gus Williams, who leads a Bullets fast break, only for Orlando Woolridge to sky for a huge block. He saved the ball from going out of bounds, and then the Bulls headed back on offense. Jordan drove to the hoop and got fouled, and then the crowd were in a frenzy. The whole sequence was excellent to watch and took place in a span of less than 55 seconds.
And Jim Brinton's call on this sequence was, boy, oh boy, end-to-end basketball, which was really, really fitting. And I apologise to all of our American listeners for that American accent, but end-to-end basketball was exactly what it was, because all this happened in the space. It felt like about 10 seconds. It was backwards and forwards, really exciting to watch.
Yeah, I loved it. That's why I actually had it down as probably the best segments of the game. It was just fantastic to see. And I think your impression there of Jim Brinson was actually more like Dick Enberg. That sounded really good if you were trying to do Dick Enberg, but anyhow.
Oh, my!
That's right, 1992 All-Star game. Well done.
Two observations that I made from the fourth quarter was that Jordan, at least twice, took the time to make sure the guys were okay after he'd fouled them. Dudley Bradley and Gus Williams were two such guys that he gave what I guess was veteran respect to. And it was really weird seeing a Bulls 33 jersey not on Scottie Pippen.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. You just get so used to seeing it after he played a good 10-plus seasons with the Bulls.
One of the great plays from the game, and probably the greatest play in the fourth quarter, was MJ stealing the ball from Rick Mahorn. And he then went coast to coast and floated in for the right-handed layup on Jeff Ruland and Gus Williams. And then he gave his signature rookie fist pump after the play.
The crowd was in an absolute frenzy at this stage, and then they gave the old standing ovation as well. So clearly the crowd was right into it, but they still had time to point out the deficiencies in Dave Corzine's game, unfortunately. The game was effectively over for Washington at that stage, and then with under 2 minutes left, Wes Matthews replaced MJ. He sat down with 16 points and again received a standing ovation from the Chicago fans. I did make note of this as well, that you can instantly see numerous people in the crowd start heading for the exits the second that MJ sat down. Of course, the Bulls were up by double digits at the time and the game was all but over, but it was noticeable, and I thought I'd make mention of that as well.
It's an unconfirmed report that a number of those people who left for the exits early were actually people that moved south to Florida.
Miami.
During the other 2000s. But yeah, the Bulls were up by 14 points, 100 to 86, just under 2 minutes to go. Yeah, and MJ checked out of his first NBA game to a standing ovation.
Fantastic, mate. We're into the last couple of minutes of the game, mate. It's effectively garbage time. And this is evidenced by the fact that 7-foot Jawan Oldham inexplicably launched a turnaround three, falling out of bounds, and it seriously missed by at least 4 feet. And the Bullets' Tom McMillan then answered with a straight-ahead three that bricked off the glass without touching the rim. Now, in the waning seconds, the Bulls' Rod Higgins, who had checked into the game, drained a three, and that brought a close to the scoring column. And the final margin of victory for the Bulls was 16 points. They were winners 109 to 93.
We've spoken several times in our episodes leading up to NBA 85 episode 6 about how excited we were about being able to speak about his regular season, and we're underway, mate. It was a lot of fun to try to break this first game of his down.
Couldn't agree more, mate. Now, a few quick stats for both teams. Orlando Warriors led the Bulls with 28 points and had 9 rebounds as well. Quinton Daly had a monster game too. He had 25 points on 12 of 16 from the field. Steve Johnson had a great game as well, 18 points and 9 boards. Jordan had a good all-around game, not a great scoring performance. He was only 5 of 16, I believe, from the field. But he had 16 points, 6 boards and 7 assists, which is very, very solid. Enes Watley had a double-double, 11 points and 10 assists. And for the Bullets, Gus Williams and Frank Johnson were 15 points apiece. They were the leading scorers. And Rick Mahorn had 14 points and 12 boards. And Jeff Ruland had 12 points. Now, a quick random stat. Chicago started the season 7-2, and then they would go on to drop 4 straight. And conversely, the Bullets started the season poorly, and they were 2-5, but then reeled off 7 straight wins.
That stat line that you mentioned of MJ's would be indicative of his impact in the statistical categories for the Bulls, as he ended up leading the Bulls in pretty much every major statistical category in his rookie year.
Yeah, absolutely phenomenal rookie year, and that's what we're going to be covering in all the future episodes of the NBA 85 podcast series. So some great stuff ahead. We're also going to be touching on various NBA games that don't involve the Bulls and just happenings throughout the association throughout the 85 season. So plenty of great stuff ahead. And I just want to take this quick opportunity to thank you for listening to the podcast. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to have a listen to Aaron and I talk endlessly about Michael Jordan and the NBA of 30 years ago. Thank you, Matthew Heasley, as well, for your great question about McFilthy and McNasty. Appreciate you chiming in, and thanks again for supporting the podcast. If you've got any questions at all that you wanted to ask, or any things that you wanted discussed during the 1985 NBA season that we recap on this series, feel free to get in touch with Aaron or myself via Twitter. It's probably the easiest way, at In All Airness. And yours, Aaron, is?
At Steeny, STEHNY, any kind of input at all for the other series. It'll give us a great thrill to give you a shout out on an episode.
We'd love to make it a bit more interactive as the series continues. There's plenty of great stuff that we'll be chatting about as the regular season gets underway, mate. Some exciting times. Is there anything else, mate, that you'd like to add before we wrap this bad boy up?
In all, giddy up.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show and share my web address with your friends and colleagues, inallairness.com. Check out the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with high-profile guests. Follow me on Twitter at inallairness. Please add your like to the show's social hub, facebook.com/inallairness. Join me next time for another edition of the show.